I'm making an onion cutting tier list. Everything from slices to dices and more. All to answer 3 questions. For home cooking, what are the best ways to slice, dice, and mince an onion? What techniques are good alternatives? And what techniques are absolutely worthless? I will be ranking the techniques based off 4 criteria: speed, safety, quality, and ease. First, we need to prep our onion. After cutting off the top, split in half and peel. Let's start with the standard dice. Cut parallel, cut vertical, cut horizontal. Boom, boom, boom. Diced onions. The standard dice is good for beginners. After all, it's the onion dicing technique. Besides that, it results in relatively even cuts for even cooking, and you can scale up the number of cuts to mince onions with the same technique. With all that said, it goes straight into C tier. Shmeh! You might be wondering how the gold standard for chefs is in C tier? Well, it turns out onions have layers. Introducing the fundamental principles of cutting onions. Onion layers are separate. Yep, that's it. This is very important, so I'm doing it again. Repeat after me. Onion layers are separate. Which means 2 things. First, onions are essentially pre-cut in a spherical axis. This can be easily observed when cutting onion rings. If you're cutting most other produce the same way, say an eggplant, you don't get rings, you get disc. And second, onions lose structural integrity as you make more cuts. Now this is true for any ingredient, but particularly so for onions, since the separate layers don't hold them together as much. The ideal technique would adhere to the principles by utilizing the natural layers and minimizing cuts. The standard dice fails on both of these principles. You're cutting in 3 axes, which is not only redundant and inefficient, but also destabilizes the onion by making a lot of extra cuts. This technique also introduces a lot of unevenness. In this onion cross section, you can see the cuts create small but uneven pieces. For all of these reasons, I put the standard dice in C tier. We can do better. Fortunately, someone figured this out and created the radial onion cut. The radial cut involves making angled cuts towards the center of the onion before cutting across. This method avoids parallel cuts, making it safer and more efficient. Sounds good, which is why it's in D tier. Don't, because it only sounds good on paper. In practice, cutting radially is a bit odd. Some of the angles put your wrist in awkward positions, and the constant angle adjustments limit how fast you can realistically cut. Plus, it's impractical to make enough cuts to radially mince onions. The resulting dice is also not particularly even. As you slice towards the center, you kind of pulverize the bits in the middle. All of which is why the radial dice is D tier. Alright, let's talk about a better method. The quick dice is a modified version of the standard dice that simply skips the parallel cuts, letting the separate layers cut the onion. It results in a less even dice, but it's easy, fast, safe, and perfectly serviceable for home cooking. This makes it the first cut in A tier approved. The only reason the quick method isn't S tier is because the method can be made even better by adding one simple step. Just start with a single parallel cut. Now I know this might seem weird since I've been so against these parallel cuts. Third axis bad, fundamental principles, yada yada. Well, this cut still follows the principles. We're working with the natural layers, which is why this one additional cut greatly increases the evenness of the dice. Compare the cross sections of the quick cut and the modified version. You're aiming to bisect the longest, most uneven pieces from the outer layers, while cutting above the smallest layers in the core. Also, since the singular parallel cut is the initial cut, it is made at peak onion stability. For me, making the one parallel cut is a mild trade-off for a substantial increase in dice quality, which makes this our first essential onion cut, S tier. Well, we have an improved version of the standard technique. How about radial? Let's talk about the mathematical radial technique. I first learned about this from Kenji Lopez Alt, whose friend theorized that the most even radial technique requires cutting towards a point 60% below the center of an onion. While researching, I discovered the world of onion math. And by that, I mean someone wrote a Medium article calculating that the true distance to aim radial cuts for the mathematically optimal onion dice is 55.73066 9040% below the center of the onion. Anyways, while that may be optimal, as you might imagine, perfectly executing the method isn't feasible. You can't really sit there measuring your onion and your cutting. I mean, you could, but don't. Also, this is theoretical math, meaning the distance works for an infinite onion with infinite layers. Real onions not only have finite layers, but also vary in shape and layer count, which changes the optimal distance onion to onion. So you could then do more math for each onion. I'll go ahead and assume you're not dicing onions to do calculus. So let's look at a practical version of the technique. So I call this balloon radial as I think the image of a hot air balloon is really helpful. Make angle cuts like you would for the normal radial technique, but aim for the skirt of an imaginary onion hot air balloon. As always, then cut across. Honestly, when you make radial cuts, you naturally sort of end up doing this anyways, but the key takeaway is to specifically not aim for the exact center. Note that the hot air balloon is an approximation of the optimal distance. This is the actual optimal angles. Compared to radial, balloon radial feels much more natural and results in a higher quality, more even dice. The less aggressive angles can be cut both faster and more comfortably. Unfortunately, this technique remains relatively slow as well as being highly variable. You need to be able to intuitively and consistently aim your cuts at the correct angle for this method to result in a small, even dice, which I personally found to be somewhat difficult. Shmeh! Next is the Indian street style. This technique involves using the tip of the knife to prevent the blade from cutting all the way through. For me, this doesn't come natural at all, and I can't do it. I tried to do it here, and I completely gave up. I can't. I literally can't. I'm not learning this. This is... Aside from being the hardest method to learn, cutting this way can be dicey. As it turns out, onions are round and round things roll, and at some point of cutting a whole onion, you're going to have to hold it up like this. When you do, sometimes it does that, or otherwise squishes and wobbles in unwanted ways. At a glance, I know it looks really impressive, but it's actually not that fast. Yeah, it takes him 10 seconds to cut the first onion, but if you keep watching, you'll see him run the knife across the cutting board several times to get a more even dice. And despite that, the end result is chunky and uneven. Plus, if you looked at all the videos, they start with peeled onions, which means if you add in the peeling step, it's even slower. So unfortunately, it's neither worth the effort to learn, nor the speed, end product, or risk. D tier. This next method I saw in Serious Eats. They didn't really name it, so I'm gonna call it safe quarters. Quarter your onion, make vertical cuts, rotate, make another set of vertical cuts, and then cut across. First of all, it's slow. There aren't any revelations here. It's just the fact that to cut half an onion, you have to process 2 quarters. Also, I didn't find this method to feel much safer. Yes, you don't make any parallel cuts, but a quartered onion not only means less room for you to guide your knife, but also less contact with the cutting board. In the end, I don't find any particularly compelling reason to actually do this. Other cuts basically outperform in all categories, so don't. I stumbled upon this next technique while making this video, and when I first saw it, I thought it was brilliant. I thought I was going straight to S tier until I actually tried it. Anyways, here's how it works. Cut the onion in half, make orbital cuts, press them into a layer, and cut across. So this is how the method is presented in the article, and it looks really good. This is how the cut looks at original speed. And this is how it looks in my experience. So the problems, well, looking at the video, it's pretty slow. You can see that after each cut, you have to meticulously pinch each slice to keep it in place. And if you don't do that, well, my footage shows the slices running up the knife. And when that happens, sometimes the layers separate, sometimes the slices fall every which way. It can all just, quite literally, start falling apart. And without nicely aligned layers, your end cut becomes super uneven. In theory, you're cutting julienne into brunoise like any other vegetable, but in practice, well, onion layers are curved. So even if you do have really nicely stacked slices, you have the same problem as a quick dice, an uneven dice with longer segments on the outside. On the other hand, all the cuts are made flat against the cutting board, so it's pretty stable. And the method itself is straightforward and easy. This all sounds really nice, but my experience is that it's finicky at best. The constant need to keep things aligned and stacked nicely makes it prone to time-consuming mistakes. Shmeh! On to mincing. Let's start with the techniques that carry over from dicing, which are standard, safe quarters, and Mattos Tanis. Technique-wise, all of these are the exact same as before, but for standard and safe quarters, as per principle number 2, more cuts, more wiggle, less safe. For mincing, the standard method is getting demoted to D tier, and safe quarters is already D tier, so I guess it's don't tier. Mattos Tanis mince is also D tier, but for a different reason. As you make more slices, you have a greater chance of making costly mistakes. Now, you could cut really slowly, very carefully, cut, pinch, but if you're going to go slowly, you might as well do the fine dining mince. There's a few videos with variations of this technique, but the crux of it is to trim and separate the onions into a few or even individual layers, then, while pressing the layers flat, make thin slices, and finally, mince. While this produces the highest quality product for most of us at home, it's a bit extra. Trimming down your onion, working in small batches. Look, I'm literally calling it the fine dining mince, so in the context of home cooking, it's a bit niche. Our first B tier. For the people out there making comments like this, I got you. The brute force method of mincing is D tier, don't. Yeah, maybe fall back to going apeshit on your cutting board, but you might as well try using a proper method. And if you didn't care about knife skills, just use a food processor. Sometime after cutting a couple dozen onions, I invented my own technique, mostly by blending together a bunch of the other cuts. It's a work in progress, but presenting the Polar Trim Mince V1. Finalizing will be my next video, or else I'm never finishing this one. If that sounds cool, subscribe. Okay, woo, yeah. Anyways, starting with half an onion, trim both curved sides so you have a stack of straight onion layers. Make vertical cuts as thinly as possible without cutting the root, and then flip the sliced onion core onto its side and brunoise. I'm not gonna mince words here. It's S tier. This is the cutting edge of onionology. Compared to the fine dining mince, the end product is less fine and less even, but it's so much faster due to how much more onion you're processing at once, and it's super stable as you mince the onion flat on its side with an intact root. Now, you do end up with some awkward cuts of onion when you trim off the sides, but this is also the case with a fine dining mince and is generally just a trade-off for a fine mince. Because you're trying to keep the root intact, slices can be somewhat difficult. Sometimes you end up shaving slices off the core. Now this would be an issue, but wait, if you stack them up, that's a fine dining mince. It's a pretty good backup plan for mistakes. In my very humble opinion, it's perfect. This is how everyone should mince onions from now on. Our last mince is grated onions. Like using a food processor, this makes more of a wet onion mush that really melts into a dish, but also like a food processor, I don't usually want to pull out and later wash a separate piece of equipment. And I only have a grate like 70% of something before it starts feeling a bit sketchy, especially with onions and the separate layers that aren't quite stable. Still, I prefer grating over a food processor to make this sort of extra processed onion. B tier. For slices and other cuts, the raking system will change. Unlike the dicing and mincing methods, end product of these cuts will vary, so I will also consider the versatility of the processed onion. First, onion rings. Originally, the only dish I could think of was onion rings, but then I found this Indian onion salad called la chapiaz, which made me realize that rings are actually super aesthetic, and that was probably a bit too narrow in my original view. Still, they're a bit niche. Bite-sized. Trim both ends and cut in half, then bisect the halves again horizontally, and then finally cut an angle into bite-sized pieces. This cut is straightforward and super quick, and it's also the easiest way to use the weird trim pieces from either fine mincing method. Personally, for most dishes, I prefer a different cut. Still, A tier. Next are the orbital and polar slices. To put it simply, orbital is cut this way and polar is cut that way. Now what's the difference? Well, we've done onion math, so let's do some onion science. Onion cells look like this. They're long and thin, and they're aligned pole to pole. So when you make polar cuts, you rupture less cells, and when you cut orbitally, you rupture more. Why does that matter? Well, injuring onion cells triggers the production of sulfurous compounds called lacrimators, which is responsible for the onion aroma as well as our tears. And second is crispness, which on a simplified level depends on the stuff inside of a plant cell to push against the cell wall. Now when the cell wall is damaged by cooking or say being cut in half, the insides ooze out, the structure is lost, and the texture is mushier. So when you make orbital cuts, you get cells cut in half, draining juice, flaccid onion. In the end, I put polar in S tier and orbital in B tier. There are certain use cases or just preference where you would want the qualities of the orbital cut, but generally I prefer polar. Next is divided. What I mean by that is halved, quarter, or whole. Cut it once, cut it twice, or don't cut it all. It's as simple as can be and just as useful. For me, I mostly associate this with roasted onions. It's basic, it's useful, it's essential. S tier. Onion blooms. To make these, level the stem side of the onion, flip and make cuts towards the center without cutting through the root. Rotate and repeat. Onion blooms are pretty and not very versatile. You can make blooming onions, you could make a pretty roasted onion, but beyond that, I can't really think of much, so it's a bit niche. And that's it, we're done. Not enough onions for you? Watch my next video. Anyways, here's the final tier list for all onion cuts. I'll also show the final individual tier lists. Okay, subscribe, bye.